Okay. Hi. Today we are going to be talking about Halloween and its history, cultural influences, and I'm going to talk mostly from an United States perspective since that's what I know best. But as most of you probably know, Halloween did not get its start in the US, although we kind of commercialized it. And I'll start by saying that I'm very happy to be here in Peru. I'm loving learning about its culture and the food, but I do have to admit that I feel a sort of regret that I'm missing the fall in the United States, which usually runs from September to November. It's really my favorite season. I love the weather. The air gets kind of crisp and chilly, and the fashion changes. All of a sudden, people have lots of layers. I love the colors because in the northwest and northeast regions of the United States where I grew up, trees are mostly deciduous, meaning that they shed their foliage every year. And so, about a month or so before, probably 2 months um, before the leaves drop, they start changing colors. Uh, they go from green to red and magenta and orange and yellow, and it's gorgeous. I'm not sure if there are areas in Peru where that happens, but I imagine not. Um, and along with all these weather changes, you can see people kind of hunkering down and getting ready for the winter. And the first holiday in the season, because we have three, we have Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, with Halloween coming first on October 31st. And the lead up to Halloween usually starts, at the end of September after a holiday that we have called Labor Day, which really marks the end of summer. And then from there on, stores begin selling all sorts of pre-made costumes, and haunted houses begin advertising just how much they'll be able to scare you this year. And all of a sudden, there are pumpkins everywhere. And there's also pumpkin flavored everything, pumpkin flavored lattes and pumpkin flavored cake and pumpkin flavored you name it. Um, and I'm sure you guys know the rest just from movies. On October 31st, All Hallows Eve, little kids everywhere, and even some adults now, get dressed up and walk from one house to another in their neighborhood, and they knock on the door and they say trick or treat, and they get a treat from their neighbors. And they put it in their bag, and they go home at the end of the night and they have pounds and pounds of candy that they'll spend the next 6 months eating. And their parents will sneak a little bit as well. And I think extra candy sometimes will get handed out to the kids who are the most creative with their costumes. But purists would point out that with the dressing up and the decorating and the candy consumption, the origins and true meaning of the holiday have really been lost. And that's what I'm more interested in talking to you guys about today, because it's actually really interesting. There's just so many different cultural forces and so much history piled on to make this holiday a very interesting one. Halloween, what we know as Halloween nowadays, really took a very long, winding path to get to where we know it today, as the set of traditions that we celebrate today. And it all actually started thousands of years ago, about 2,000 years ago. Everything from the costumes to the haunted houses to the mass solicitations of candy have their root in Celtic traditions. So I say it can be traced back 2,000 years, but that's the estimate, right? So some think that Halloween, which started out as All Hallows Eve, and Eve means the night before something, so you have Christmas Eve, which is the night before Christmas. So some think that Halloween, known as All Hallows Eve, can be traced back about 2,000 years to a pre-Christian Celtic festival that was held around November 1st. And this festival was called Samhain. And Samhain in Gaelic means summer's end. The feast was celebrated in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and then parts of Britain as well. Now, there are very fragmentary records, and records aren't very common, they're very sparse. And so the exact nature of Samhain is not fully understood, but what we do know is that it was an annual communal meeting at the end of the harvest year. It was a time to gather resources for the winter months and bring animals back from the pastures, in some cases. And moments of transition like that during the year have always been thought in many cultures, right, to be special, and sometimes they even take on a supernatural bent. And so it's no surprise that Samhain is also thought to have been a time of communing with the dead, because there was a belief that during this transition period, at this particular time of year, the barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead was weakened, and so spirits of the dead would be able to cross over into the other world. And in order to appease and welcome the spirits, there would be places set at the feast table, and the Celts would also offer food and drink and light bonfires to ward off the evil spirits. So there was a Roman presence in Celtic territory, Roman control for about 400 years. And so this feast that occurred at this time of year, that eventually became Halloween, also has some elements of Roman celebrations of the goddess Pomona. And Pomona was the goddess of fruit and trees. And for us, a lot of the trees that are celebrated nowadays in these kinds of celebrations are those that bear fruit around this time, so apple trees most of all. And excuse me, the feast of Pomona was like a harvest feast, so like Samhain, and that actually is supposedly the origin of certain elements of our Halloween celebrations in the United States today. For instance, we do what's called bobbing for apples. And if you've never heard of bobbing for apples, it seems pretty silly. You take a big barrel, you fill it up with water, and you toss apples into the water, and the apples float. And people take turns with their hands behind their back trying to snag an apple out of the barrel with just their mouths. And again, it's silly, but it had importance in American celebrations, I think usually during Halloween, ever since the colonial era. And at that point in the colonial era, it was used for fortune telling. So legend had it that the first person to pluck an apple from the barrel without using his or her hands would be the first person to get married in the coming year. And there are many different versions of the tradition. You know, sometimes they would write the name of a person on a piece of paper, or probably not paper since you're putting it in water, but somehow attach the name maybe on a piece of twine to the stem of the apple. And so whatever apple you happen to come up with, if whomever's name was written on the stem, that was who you were going to marry. And then the taste of the apple could indicate the quality of the future marriage. It could be acid, soft, fiery, sweet. Just interesting ideas. But I'm going to go back a little bit back to Samhain, the Celtic harvest festival. And at some point, Christianity came to the British Isles, and we saw what happened there, along with, as in the case of the arrival of Christianity to other areas and other cultures. They figured that the best way to convert people was not to ban the already present and very deeply rooted cultural practices, but rather to incorporate those practices into already Christian or into other Christian celebrations. So it just so happened that November 1st was the Christian feast of All Saints, which I think you are all familiar with. And during that celebration, Christians would honor saints and pray for souls who had not reached heaven yet. And so October 31st became the Eve of All Saints, or All Hallows Eve, because hallows is another word that indicates holiness. And so the name All Hallows Eve eventually morphed into Halloween. So we can see that the modern practice of Halloween incorporates Christianity and pagan rituals, a little bit of a Roman influence. But then we have things like disguises and trick-or-treating that we do nowadays. And what do those have to do with the celebration? Well, it's believed that the Celts dressed up in white with blackened faces during the festival of Samhain, during the festival of Samhain, to trick the evil spirits that they believed would be roaming the earth. And they would go door to door asking for food. By the 11th century, this had been adapted by the church into a tradition called souling, from soul, and this was seen as the origin of trick-or-treating. So children would go door to door, this time not just asking for food in general, but for soul cakes in exchange for praying for the souls of friends and relatives, and they would go dressed up as angels, demons, or saints. And the soul cakes they were asking for were sweet, and they had a cross marked on top, and when they were eaten, that represented a soul being freed from purgatory. And these aren't the only traditions that we see involve asking for food. These rituals of mass solicitation are actually pretty common, and they're usually associated with the fall and winter, since that's a time of either preparation for scarcity or, during the months of winter, scarcity, where food is harder to come by. And then in terms of the trick part of trick-or-treating, I talked about a couple of these traditions and how, you were asking for food in general or soul cakes. And over time, these kind of morphed from a simple request for food to threats of mischief if the person at the door, knocking on the door, was not welcomed and provided with what they were asking for. So instead of saying, can I have some food, it was, if you don't give me food, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. In Britain and Ireland, by the 19th century, there are many accounts of people going house to house in costume at Halloween, reciting verses in exchange for food, which could be considered a trick, and sometimes warning of misfortune if they were not welcomed. When it comes to the United States, these days the trick part of the phrase trick or treat is mostly an empty threat, or trick can also, instead of being understood as a necessarily negative act, a trick can also be something funny or interesting, like if you tell a joke, that would be considered a trick. But pranks also played a big part of Halloween in the United States up until about the 1950s. So Halloween had been celebrated in some way since the colonial era in the United States, like I mentioned. But then during the second half of the 19th century, America was flooded with new immigrants. And this included a big wave of the Irish who were fleeing from the potato famine in Ireland that occurred during the 1840s. And they brought their Halloween customs with them. By the late 1800s, the tradition of playing tricks on Halloween was well established, and in the United States and Canada, the pranks included tipping over outhouses, opening farmers' gates to let their animals out, throwing eggs at houses, which is known as egging houses. But then by the 1920s and 1930s, these acts of vandalism started to get more serious. Some people believed that the pranking was starting to get dangerous and out of hand, and so parents and town leaders began to encourage dressing up and trick-or-treating as a safe alternative to doing pranks. And as a result, Halloween came to resemble, at least in the United States again, the more sort of community-centered holiday that it's seen as nowadays. And it also helped that during the 1940s and the 1950s, people were moving out of the cities into the suburbs, and the suburbs provided a very safe place for kids to roam around asking for sweets. And so that's a very condensed version of how Halloween came to be what it is today in the United States. But before I finish, I wanted to talk about one last part of Halloween that I've always found really fun. And it's the folklore. And I'm going to give one example, which is the folklore surrounding the jack-o'-lantern. The term jack-o'-lantern was first applied to people, not pumpkins. So jack-o of lantern. So Jack of the Lantern. And the term meant a man with a lantern or a watchman. But over the years, it also began to be used to refer to these sort of mysterious lights that sometimes were seen at night over bogs, swamps, and marshes. These ghost lights now have a scientific explanation. Bogs and swamps are actually composed of a lot of decaying and decomposing plant matter. And this process of decay actually produces a lot of gases, and those gases ignite as they come into contact with either electricity or even heat. So very sensitive, they're very volatile. I find this so interesting, but obviously, this scientific explanation hasn't been around all that long, and so for the centuries before science came to explain what was happening, people needed a way to explain what they were seeing, and so they told stories to explain these mysterious lights. In Ireland, dating as far back as the 1500s, those stories often revolved around a guy named Stingy Jack. As the story goes, Stingy Jack invited the devil to join him for a drink. Stingy Jack did not want to pay for the drinks from his own pocket, and so he instead convinced the devil to turn himself into a coin, and Stingy Jack was then going to use that coin to pay for what they consumed. So the devil goes ahead and he turns himself into a coin, but instead of paying, Jack skips out on the bill, and instead he keeps the devil coin in his pocket. And it just so happens that he has a silver cross in his pocket, and this silver cross prevents the devil from being able to shift back into his original form. And Jack eventually lets the devil loose, but only after the devil promised that only after the devil promises that he won't seek revenge on Jack and he won't claim his soul when Jack eventually dies. So, I guess Jack lives maybe a long life, and he eventually dies, but he gets to the gates of heaven and God won't let him in. And the devil obviously is going to keep his promise, so he rejects Jack's soul at the gates of hell as well. So instead, the devil gives Jack a single burning coal to light his way, and he sends him off into the night to find his own hell. And Jack puts the coal in a carved out turnip. And turnips, I guess, were a favorite food of his. He always had a couple with him, so he had a turnip. He carved it out, he put the coal in, and it served as a sort of lantern. And ever since then, Jack has supposedly been roaming the earth with the lantern, trying to find a resting place for his soul. And in Ireland, the ghost lights seen in the swamps were said to be Jack's improvised lantern, the turnip lantern, moving about as his restless soul wanders the countryside. He and the lights were dubbed Jack of the Lantern, and that became Jack-o'-lantern. And this legend actually immigrated to the New World with the Irish, and it collided with another Old World tradition and a New World crop. So making vegetable lanterns was a tradition of the British Isles, and you would stuff turnips, beets, and potatoes with coal or candles as sort of impromptu lanterns to celebrate the fall harvest. And as a prank, kids would sometimes wander off the road with a glowing veggie to try and trick their friends or travelers into thinking that they were Stingy Jack or another lost soul. In America, that was in Ireland, and then in America, pumpkins were very easy to come by, and they were great for carving, and they were also much bigger than a turnip, for example. And so they also got absorbed into both the carved lantern tradition and the prank that went along with it. And over time, kids refined the prank, and they began carving sort of crude faces into the pumpkins to kick up the fright factor and make the lanterns look like disembodied heads. And so by the mid-1800s, Stingy Jack's nickname was applied to the prank pumpkin lanterns that echoed his lamp, and that's how the pumpkin jack-o'-lanterns got their name. And I think they were only really used for the prank in the U.S. up until, I don't remember what the year, maybe towards the end of the 19th century, there was a mayor and his wife who threw a party, the mayor of Atlanta, and they used these jack-o'-lanterns as decorations, and somehow that set off the trend. So they went from being just a trick, the jack-o'-lanterns went from being just a trick to a standard seasonal decoration, and now that's something that everyone does nowadays in the US for Halloween, a couple of weeks before Halloween. Not too far ahead of the holiday, because you don't want your pumpkin to be all shrunken and shriveled and falling apart by Halloween. But a week or two ahead of time, everyone goes to the grocery store and grabs their pumpkin and scoops out all the seeds. We usually eat the seeds. We'll separate the seeds from the pulp and roast them with olive oil and salt. It's really good. And then you also carve. People can get pretty creative. So I just really like that story. I think I've always really enjoyed the folklore surrounding scientific processes that we've later come to understand better, and how creative the solutions and how imaginative they are. And you can see that Halloween is a very rich mix, a very varied mix of customs and tradition, and then you pile all this history onto it. You have the celebrations of the harvest, you have preparations for winter, you have communing with the dead on the pagan side, and on the Christian side, there's the desire to look out for lost souls, and then you add, like I said, thousands of years of history, immigration, demographic, and cultural changes, and what you have is a really interesting picture. So I hope you've enjoyed this lesson about Halloween traditions and that you learned something new.